really need to get together and let our voices be heard.
This is Buffalo What's Next. I'm Jay Moran.
I'm Bridget Jaipal Valenza.
I'm Dave Debo.
And I'm Thomas O'Neill White.
After May 14th, how can we afford not to talk about race?
About education, about segregation, about humanity.
Since the dawn of this nation, racial violence has existed.
The way we have designed our society has a big hand in what occurred in that Tops Market.
The suburban area, everywhere. We must work and teach our children.
We need to make sure that we put more funding in our programs that help prevent gun violence and more money into art.
If we're going to have some real healing, we've got to have space to tell some uncomfortable truths.
And this is Dave Debo. Coming up on the program today, Jacqueline Cherry will be here. She's Assistant Director of Dance at the African American Cultural Centers. We'll talk about a lot of things, critical race theory, how the arts can help healing, and more. That's with Bridget Jaipal Valenza, coming up in the second part of the program today. But first, what a morning it is to talk politics. It's the morning after a primary election. We'll take some time to talk about that through the lens, as this program does, of racial equity issues. Professor Peter Yaccobucci is here from the Political Science Department at SUNY Buffalo State. Warren Galloway is here. He's been a mainstay of our election coverage in years past, a Republican analyst and former county official. Perhaps relevant, though, because in the past, he has many years ago led a project to get more black and brown people into the GOP locally. A guy with a lot of expertise on this topic. So, Warren, let's start with you. Thank you, gentlemen, both, for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Warren, to what degree do the Republicans have a problem with embracing people of color? I know it's a discussion point nationally, but does that problem exist here in Western New York?
Oh, definitely. The Republican Party, especially the Erie County Republican Party, is basically non-livable in dealing with minority issues. They really didn't take a stand even on the May 14th massacre at Tops. You didn't hear anything from the local Republican leaders. Nick Langworthy went to Tops, along with the Republican governor candidate.
Lee Zeldin?
Yes, Zeldin. They went to Tops, they laid some flowers, but they didn't even deal with the issue about white supremacist man coming into the black community massacring. All they said, we're against the red law because we don't want to affect gun owners' rights. So it just shows you that they're not really interested. And even their issues when they nominate people for offices, they basically they leave the city alone or the first-ring suburbs alone. They deal strictly in the rural communities where they got one or two issues that they can relate to.
What can be done about that, if anything, ever?
Well, if you look at the historical presence of the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, a lot of you African Americans stayed Republicans until the 1954-55 elections. That's when they started switching on the Democratic side. But I could tell you that many of my grandfather and a lot of my older aunts and uncles, when they came up through the Buffalo ranks, they were all registered Republicans. The first black elected official in the city of Buffalo was a Republican. So when you look at this historically, but they have now taken issues that don't relate to the African American community, and they're focused strictly on the rural community. And they have gotten just based on a few issues and not dealing with the whole piece of the pie.
And I look at the 23rd Congressional District. The new lines were drawn, and that's why there was a primary yesterday. It includes mostly rural areas, mostly a Republican district. Charlie Cook at the Cook Report analyzes these things and says it skews Republican by about 24 points in any typical election. It's Allegheny, Chautauqua, and Cattaraugus counties. It kind of snakes up through a little bit more of the southern tier over to Schuyler County. But for the first time, it also has a spike that reaches up into Erie County, which is why yesterday, during the primary, we had two Erie County candidates running in the GOP primary, Carl Palladino and Nick Langworthy, who you mentioned just a bit earlier. Nick Langworthy is ahead by about 2,000 votes. Palladino has not yet conceded. He says there were some irregularities worth looking at. For example, on the State Board of Elections website, at one point it had no votes in, but Langworthy's still ahead. That's something that Palladino says he wants to look at. So the race is still active. But the reason I mentioned the shape of the district, Warren, is you were talking about how they appeal to mostly rural voters. This particular district is mostly white rural voters, and yet they seem to have rejected Carl Palladino, who has made some racist comments in the past. Is there hope there for you, or is there something else going on that just made Langworthy a better candidate? I don't want to impugn. I don't want to say race was the issue if race wasn't the issue.
No, Nick Langworthy won strictly on an organizational vote.
He's a current
statewide chairman, and when you have a low voter turnout like this, that's the machine vote. Carl won Erie County, and we noticed that Erie County has a very weak Republican leadership in the Erie County Republican Party, and that showed. But where Nick won the rural communities, them were all Republican chairmen who supported him, and that was a machine vote. I don't think it was very much of an issue-orientated vote. They both used Trump's name, which might help him down there, but it's not going to help him no place else.
So you don't necessarily think that a Palladino loss means that the rural voters have in any way changed their attitudes towards someone with racial comments and baggage like Carl Palladino?
Well, they both do.
Okay.
I mean, look at Nick Langworthy, the way he deals with the Republican statewide party. I mean, he has never spoken on no issues on race in his state since he's been chairman of the Erie County Republican Party, and never when he was the state chairman.
Warren Galloway is with us. He's a former county official, a Republican who has done some outreach a long time ago, and we'll talk about this before the program's done, some outreach to people of color within the Republican Party. Peter Yaccobucci is also here. Peter, thanks for joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
SUNY Buffalo State political science professor. As a technique, talk a little bit about Palladino's style. He has said repeatedly that he's not a racist. He has made some racist comments. He says that racism is not in his heart, but he still says things that no doubt offend black people. Is that a dog whistle? Is that a way of riling up the base, but then at the same time saying, oh, I was just joking?
Oh, I think certainly it is. I think he's following the pattern that President Trump or ex-President Trump laid out. And it's, say something outrageous and then back away from it. But everybody knows the outrageous statement is what was truly meant. And even by backing away from it, it just makes the media repeat the racist statement. I think, in this particular race, in New York 23, you had candidates that, for the most part, agree on almost every single policy issue. So it's not a policy race.
No substance, you're talking style.
Yeah, it's a style. This is a style race. And you have Carl, who's bombastic, aggressive, in the mold of Donald Trump, where Nick Langworthy is more, as Warren just stated, he's got a machine behind him, and he knows how to do grassroots politics, and especially in the southern tier, that's what it looks like won the race for him.
So you don't look at this result and say necessarily that mostly white rural voters that in the past had aligned with Trump, you don't say that those people have rejected Palladino, do you?
No, I don't think so. I think, as Warren pointed out, and anytime you have a very low turnout race, and this is a very low turnout race, you're looking at the individuals that are motivated by local party actions. So Nick Langworthy spent most of his time down in the southern tier, campaigning, meeting people, going to events, going to, fundraisers and dinners. Carl didn't, and that cost probably Carl the election. Carl assumed that because of his name, because of who he was, a former Republican nominee for the governor across the state, that would be enough. Nick worked harder, and that's probably the best way to describe it in this race.
And let's look at Palladino's history. He ran for governor, lost, ran for school board, won, but was ousted, and now ran for Congress and lost. He's had roughly 3 elections that he's been involved in. Langworthy, on the other hand, born in Chautauqua County, significant perhaps for this district, and learned at the knee of Congressman, former county legislator, former Erie County Chair, Tom Reynolds.
Yes.
Nick has been involved in campaigns a lot more than Carl.
Yeah, organizational campaigns. and
running campaigns,
and being under the mentorship of Tom Reynolds, he learned how to deal with people, learned how to deal. The only thing he didn't take from Tom that Tom was very good, Tom knew how to reach into the minority community. When he was a legislature, he and Roger Blackwell worked very well together. So,
Roger was chair of the Erie County Legislature at a time when Tom, I think, was the minority leader for the Republicans.
Yeah, but they worked very well. They knew how to compromise to get things done. Even when Tom was congressman, and at that time I was working for County Executive Joe Giambra, Tom got involved with a lot of funding issues going through the county and the state at the time, Governor Pataki, to get money for certain minority organizations on the east side. So Tom knew how to play the political game. Nick hasn't learned that yet. Or Nick has come out there that I got to deal with strictly these rural white folks. I don't have the time to deal with African Americans. I'm not interested in expanding the party because we reach into the city all the time and we always get our butts kicked. So he basically came back, we aren't going to deal with city issues instead of coming up with candidates that might relate to African Americans. And he never did that.
I alluded to it earlier, though. Once upon a time, you were involved in an effort with the GOP party to try and, that's redundant, GOP party, like ATM machine. You were involved with the party at one point trying to bring more people of color into the local Republican Party. Give me some of the history. Tell me how that worked.
Yeah, we developed a group called Republicans of Color, ROC. At that time when we formed it, we had some middle-of-the-road Republicans. We had a George Pataki governor. We had a Bob Davis, Erie County chairman. Plus you had the Joe Giambra as a Republican who was basically grew up as a Democrat.
Right.
So you had a better flow of people with the moderates, and they understood trying to expand the party base.
But did it work? Were you able to?
We were able to do things. We ran candidates. We knew that, like, even when Joe ran for county executive against a Dennis Gorski, he got 11% of the black vote, which is okay. I mean, we would love to get 20, 25, but that little 10% helped him beat a powerful a Democrat in Dennis Gorski. So you win by not having a majority. You can win based on getting a certain percentage that takes away from that majority Republican candidate. A Democrat candidate. So that's what we were trying to do. But, after Joe left, Pataki left, Bob Davis left, and Chris Collins was strictly a suburban county legislature. He didn't even want to deal with the inner city. Yeah. And that's the way that the Republicans have developed over these years.
And so it wasn't necessarily anything that we've seen on the national level. It was just a local swing of the pendulum away from moderate Republicans.
Yeah, I think historically is that any Republican that won statewide has been a moderate Republican. Nelson Rockefeller, Jacob Javits, George Pataki. These were not the far-right Republicans. Even you look on the other side, a far-left Democrat won't win statewide. We're a state, basically, I call us the centrists. We believe government has a responsibility in certain things. Now, the other laws, we have problems, gun control and abortion rights. But see, we're starting now to say the abortion rights, they're not pro-life. They're pro-birth. Because if you were pro-life, you wouldn't cut all the programs to make sure that baby's raised in a healthy environment. All they're interested in is pro-birth, where they're not. And then after their birth, we cut all the programs to guarantee them to be a pro-life person.
Professor Robert Spitzer at Cortland State College has written a book called The Encyclopedia of Gun Control, one of about 4 books he's written on the topic. I interviewed him once, and he really kind of gave me that eureka moment. He said that gun control is not necessarily a Republican versus Democrat issue. It is a rural versus urban issue because the rural voters want their hunting and the urban voters, to a greater degree, have seen gun violence.
Mm-hmm.
And that, to me, was again, a bit of a eureka moment, because I think the issue of gun control is usually framed along party lines, but not necessarily the case here.
Well, if you look at the history of gun control during the Al Capone days, the NRA at the time and the Republicans, they're the ones that fought for gun control, banning these submachine guns. The NRA supported that legislation. Then if you go further, in California, when the Black Panthers went to the Sacramento state capitol with guns, all of a sudden Ronald Reagan and the Republicans back then, they were for gun control. So they were playing it once it got on the other hand.
Interesting. You talked about the way the pendulum on the local level has swung away from moderates. Peter, we've certainly seen the same on the national level. Maybe Erie County started the swing a little bit sooner, but why is it that politics in general are more divided? Why is it that the Republican Party has swung from more moderate roots to where it is today?
Well, I mean, it was a conscious decision. It's a strategic decision. It's the idea we can use issues, hot button issues, abortion, gun rights, race relations. And, Warren mentioned Chris Collins, and it's not just Chris Collins, but Chris Collins, instead of trying to recruit conservative, Republican, ideological leaning individuals within the city, instead demonized the city and instead said, look, my suburban voters, my rural voters, we got to do everything we can to hold back what's going on in the city. That's a conscious political strategic decision. And, we saw it with President Trump clearly. And the idea is, well, we'll juice up the base to an extreme, we'll eschew any crossing the aisle to that. And the idea that if we can juice up the base and if we can control district borders through gerrymandering to such an extent, we don't need to appeal across the aisle. We can guarantee ourselves wins. And that, that's been going on for certainly pre-Trump, but for a while. But we saw with Trump, and especially with recent candidates, that is really the model right now, at least at the national level for Republicans.
It's interesting to note that you mentioned gerrymandering. The aforementioned Tom Reynolds, after his congressional career, was talking about a lot of issues. And I recall asking him once the same question, why are we so divided? And he said, gerrymandering, because you have districts now that are so very Democrat, or you have districts now that are so very Republican, that it just lends it to an extreme person winning the district rather than a moderate.
No, certainly. I mean, and not just here, across the country. And, we've seen the fight over gerrymandering here in New York, as we just had the 2020 census and the redistricting. But look at New York 23. New York 23 is made the shape it is to isolate Republican voters into one district so that Democrats can pick up more districts. And if the Democrats' plan had fully gone through, they would pick up a few more seats. We see that in Republican states moving the opposite direction. I will say gerrymandering is not a partisan issue. Both parties happily do it if they have control of the redistricting process.
But I wonder, I want to go back to what you said, Warren, about how the change came about when moderate Republicans were a thing of the past. Republicans were then not able to embrace people of color as well. Do we also lay this shift then, the lack of interest in the minority vote, at the feet of gerrymandering?
I think it's a gerrymandering is a result of that. I think that what...
Oh, you're turning it around. You're not saying one caused the other. You're saying gerrymandering. I got you now.
Yeah. Well, because when you look at how the Republicans think that they are winning, they might win a district seat or a congressional seat, but that's not filtering in to win the whole pie. We have a congressman coming from the 23rd and a congresswoman coming from the 24th. The
Claudia Tenney.
Yeah,
right. Her district was redrawn. She had to move to Canandaigua.
So what I'm saying is that you might be a Republican, but if you don't control the House, what difference does it make?
All right.
And now we only have one upstate Democrat congressman, and that's Higgins, who basically took over a whole rural urban center that, basically controls that whole district. And if you look at going across the state, look at who's the congressman in Rochester or Syracuse. But Rochester, they divided up that area so much that you'll never see I don't think, a strong Democrat congressman from that area because they just wiped up the city so much.
Do you think that, broadly speaking, the black vote has been diluted? Or is it a matter of, okay, this district is Republican, this district over here is Democrat?
No, I think the black community has basically, we are hemmed in. We are considered strictly urban voters because of the segregation and racism in moving out to the suburbs. We look at the suburban migration in Erie County. Most of your blacks are the first-ranked suburbs of Cheektowaga and maybe a little Amherst. Even Tonawanda, we're not out there in the numbers. You go south, Hamburg or Orchard Park, unless you're a football player, you live in Orchard Park, okay? But further down, you could count them on one hand. That's like when you become running in this area as a Supreme Court judge. If a black can't get the bipartisan, like the games that the parties play.
Yeah, judges are always cross-endorsed by both parties.
Because if a black runs strictly as a Democrat, he might win Erie and Niagara County. Boy, but once he goes to Wyoming County, Cattaraugus County, that's where they lose. So, that's the way this suburban area, Rochester, Syracuse is the same way. You leave Syracuse and Rochester, go out in those suburban areas, there's hardly no blacks out there at all.
Is the solution then just to completely get rid of gerrymandering?
You'll never do that.
You sensed my follow-up question.
Yeah.
Because even when the city of Buffalo City Council drew up new city council districts, and it's a majority-minority city council, they still, according to many people, gerrymandered in certain people, so the incumbents have an advantage.
That's the difference, I think, with philosophies. The people who are complaining about the city results were basically West Side people. You didn't hear nobody from the East Side complain about nothing. And here they wanted to wipe out one district that a black has a better ability to win, the Fillmore, and develop Allentown, Elmwood, that you'll never see a black win that seat ever.
Because of the way it's drawn, or just because of the population?
The population.
Gotcha. Okay. So, again, the discussion broadens to segregation. The fact that 70-some% of the blacks in the city of Buffalo are east of Main Street.
Yeah.
That hasn't changed. That line of Main Street has been there since
ever.
Both of us were little kids. and you can lay the blame at is a number of people, but certainly the political leadership of both parties can take blame for that continued at least residential segregation within the city.
Sure, and it's something we've kicked about on this program a lot, obviously, in light of the top shootings. Let me broaden the discussion a little bit then to 514. Do you see that, Peter, as an event that in any way long-term will change our politics?
I would hope it is. My initial impression after, 3 months out?
About that, little longer.
3 months.
Sure.
I don't see it happening. It has very quickly disappeared, and part of that is gun violence in America. There's always another shooting coming, and we have not seen significant change. We did have a federal law passed, but whether that federal law will have the change that's necessary to stop gun violence, I don't believe so. I focus on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court just released a decision that eliminated one of New York State's gun protection laws. So the Supreme Court is not going to be helpful in that area. So unfortunately, I don't see it. It's going to take local leadership of both parties, but especially the Democratic Party, focusing on the East Side and the residents of the East Side, and I just don't see that happening.
All right, Warren Galloway, same question. What has changed politically, or what?
I hope. Well, actually, nothing really. I think all during the time after the massacre, one of the most embarrassing persons in the city had to be Mayor Brown. You're bringing in all these national leaders, black leaders, bringing them to tops, and they see one supermarket in this town, and they see an area around it, all these vacant lots. Then I look at a mayor who's been a mayor of a black city, a black man, over 16, going on 20 years, and your base has looked like this. What have you done?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's what you think. If the politics of top doesn't reflect what needs to be done, yeah, everybody loves low-income housing. Why do developers build low-income housing? Because they get government money. If they go in there and develop neighborhoods, new housing, there's no government subsidies for middle-class housing, so they don't do it. But if you drive down an Elmwood or a Hurdle, why are those cities, areas progressing? Walk down those streets and look down the side streets. You don't see any vacant lots. You see homeowners and houses. You go down Jefferson and Fillmore, look down those side streets. I used to be a paper boy on Landon back in the day from Wolders to Jefferson. I had 55 customers, never forget. If I had that same paper route today, I would be lucky to have 13 customers because of the amount of empty lots on that block. That's how you're going to develop an economic base.
And yet we have had candidates for mayor, and I'm not even thinking most recently India Walton. Let's go back to the primary in 2017. Betty Jean Grant, Mark Schroeder, and Byron Brown. Betty Jean pretty much ran on a campaign of notice the East Side, pay attention to the East Side, and she lost. India Walton, notice the East Side, pay attention to the East Side, and she lost. What's up with that?
Well, again, who saved Byron Brown? The Republicans. He came, as soon as he came out and lost the primary, he called her a socialist. He ran on issues that mobilizes that Republican base. Defund the police department and you're a socialist. That's who pushed him over. India, after she won the primary, her mistake was that she did not try to reach out to bring more people into her camp. The same base that supported her in the primary, that was the same base she had in November. She never expanded the base. You'll never win that way.
All right. Closing comments from each of you. Are you optimistic? What do you think the city needs? Peter, we'll start with you.
Sadly, as someone who grew up here and then moved back, I'm not very optimistic. And I love this city. And I think the city needs strong leadership. And it needs leadership coming from both the county and the city government to invest in minority communities in a way that's lasting and then a way that's sustained. Not simply a flash of, a terrible event, a tragic event happened on Jefferson Avenue, so we're going to splash some money on Jefferson Avenue. Mm-hmm. And then, we're 3 months out and it, that's gone. You don't hear politicians talking about it anymore.
I thought I was winding up, but I want to follow.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I want to follow up on something you just said. Governor Kathy Hochul has given $58 million to the East Side. We're still kind of unsure how that'll play out and who exactly gets that money. But I want you to comment on that for a second before we continue, because the consensus or the idea is that, the East Side's never gotten that money. Politicians haven't gone there. Now we have a shooting. A politician has gone there. Do you see it making a difference?
Well, look, $58 million is $58 million. It's certainly better than nothing. But that's my whole thought is it's a one-time, let's inject $58 million. You mentioned yourself, we're not quite sure how that money's going to get out, who's going to get it, how that's going to be defined. I would much rather her make a commitment that we're willing to commit, $5 million per year over the next 20 years to develop the East Side. Not here's a splash money. We don't know how it, and things like that come out that quickly are usually not well administered. I'd much rather be at a long-term program than a simple one-time deal.
Okay, so that's basically why you're not optimistic.
Yes, that's
all right. That's Peter Yaccobucci, professor of political science at SUNY Buffalo State. Warren Galloway, you again. You've been on our election night for years. You're a Republican analyst. You're a guy who's tried to reach out to communities of color with the Republican Party. What does the city need, and are you optimistic?
I think the city needs people with vision. You know, the Bible talks about my people with no vision shall perish. We've had leaders with no really vision. You know, I look at the Tops supermarket. Tops was built under a Mazziello administration. Then if you look across the street, you got that other strip plaza. That was built under Jimmy Griffin through Palladino's Ellicott Development Company. Then I look at what has a Byron Brown developed on that same strip. Nothing. So you need people with vision, people who understand, and you need a big mind. One of the biggest things that Mayor White of Cleveland did a long time ago when he was a young mayor, he told the other corporations, I got this money, I can do all the infrastructure developments, but I need you to invest in this money, you know, the private sector money. That's what they did in Baltimore. You got to come up with the visions of doing more public-private partnerships. That you got to, government got to do something, but also entice the public, the private, to come in and do what they got to do. And until that happens, and as you said, the governor announced all this money. Look at what the city got for the pandemic money. Basically, it saved the city from going into financial disaster. Paid off its bad debts and helped lower the taxes, but you still had our property taxes raised. So instead of worrying about, I'm a mayor of not raising taxes, we need people in there now who could do something and do a meaningful change.
But we saw, and I thought I was winding up, but we've still got some time. We saw what happens when a mayor runs on a platform of change. India Walton did not get that far once it came to the general election.
We're not the black community, especially, they're not a really leftist group of people. Blacks are centrists. You know, my father didn't have a credit card. He believed in putting things in layaway, you know. That's the oldest.
As a conservative thing.
Yeah,
right. I get you.
So. And most of your blacks, unfortunately, the leftists have using black issues to get their strength, at the same time hurting the overall objective of the black community. That's just what the reapportionment with this group that's fighting the new districts. They're using racism, trying to get the mayor's and his council's redistricting plan void. How can you use the race saying that this is racism when most of the people who's condemning it are white West Side people? So it's another group that shows you that the leftists are using minority issues to try to strengthen their base.
Warren, you've heard him on our election night coverage on a regular basis. There's one thing I have to ask you before we go.
Yeah.
Tell me about something else you're involved in, completely separate from today's discussion. You are I'm the chairman of the African American Veterans Monument Committee.
All right. That we developed, and it's in the construction now, a monument that represents all the African Americans who served in all the wars and conflicts that this country has ever been in, Revolutionary War to now. There's no other monument like that in this country that represents all of them. We're having the unveiling of the monument September 24th at the Buffalo Naval Park. And this is the first. We've been working on it for 5+ years. And this monument is not only a memorial to honor them, but to educate the community on the effects and what African Americans have done in this country, fighting the wars, basically fighting 2 wars. A war against Germany and Japan, and then a war of racism when they come home.
In large part, you just answered my next question. Why is a monument like that needed?
For education. If I tell you the first person killed in the Revolutionary War was a black man, would you bleave it?
Crispus Attucks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I would tell you that there was a unit in World War I called the Harlem Hellfighters, they could not fight with the American soldiers in World War I because of segregation. They were assigned to the French army to fight the same German enemies, and they were the most decorated group of soldiers ever from the French government.
Where on the waterfront will it go?
It's right at the Buffalo Naval Military Park, right on the Erie Boulevard.
And the unveiling is September 24th?
Yes.
All right. Well, we'll follow up on that. Gentlemen, this has been great. Thank you both for being here. Warren Galloway, Professor Peter Yaccobucci. Stay with us. Bridget Jaipal Valenza is next. She'll talk about critical race theory, how the arts can help healing, and more. Jacqueline Cherry standing by from the African American Cultural Center. Stay with us. This is Buffalo What's Next on WBFO.
Hey, we used to love this song. How many special people change? How many lives are living straight? We still do, but we used to too. WBFO The Bridge, college radio for adults. Check us out on the WBFO The Bridge app and, of course, WBFO.org/The Bridge.
This is Buffalo What's Next, where we have conversations with the community about moving forward. To have your voice heard, press the Talk to Us button on the WBFO app, and we'll work to get your questions and comments on the air. Join us on Twitter @WBFO or email us at news@WBFO.org. Together, we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is WBFO, your NPR station.
Hello, I'm host Bridget Jaipal Valenza. Today, we are here with Jacqueline Cherry, the Assistant Director of Dance at the African American Cultural Center. Jacqueline, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking, and thank you for having me here. I'm excited about some of the things that I'm seeing and experiencing and participating in, so I'm doing pretty well.
It's been such a difficult time for everyone in Buffalo, dealing with everything that's happened, the emotions around it, the politics around it. For our listeners, you may have already seen Jackie. Can I call you Jackie?
Please.
Thank you. Performing most recently at the Tops, reopening. When it reopened, talk to me about your dancing. When did you start, or when did you know?
Oh, I used to watch In Living Color a lot. And I loved those fly girls so much. And I said, one day, I want to be a fly girl. And I loved watching them dance. And so I got into dance classes about age 10, I think. And I just never stopped. I just love dancing.
And indeed, you are a fly girl.
Hey, thank you. Take one to Noah, honey.
Thank you. Was it a difficult decision for you? And, sort of how do your parents react to, okay, this is what I want to do. This is how I want to live my life and express myself. And, that can sometimes be a challenge for parents to hear, hey, child of mine, I'm going into the arts.
Well, actually, my mother and sister are both music teachers. My brother plays drums and he writes music. So I come from a very musical family. Mm-hmm. And so actually the idea was that I was supposed to pick up something in the arts, play some kind of instrument or something. I do sing. But because my mother and sister are really good at piano and organ playing, I was like, I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to go over here and dance.
Because it's helpful not to necessarily have a compare and contrast.
I'm going to just let them have
their thing.
All the glory that they, that they deserve.
So it's only recently, in recent memory, that point shoes. Now, point shoes, for people who don't know what those are the shoes that ballerinas wear. So it's only in recent memory, in recent times, that pointe shoes actually come now in different colors. They come in black and brown skin tone colors versus non-black and brown skin tone colors. As a woman of color, was it difficult when you went to school, when you were training, especially in an environment where there isn't that much representation?
Oh, yeah. Ballet, for the longest time, ballet was considered the foundation of dance, the foundation of all important movement. And that is being confronted now. But as a black dancer with a black body and features to my body that are not Eurocentric, I've been ridiculed and criticized, and I had a very difficult time really with the fact that I wasn't accepted in ballet the way that I wanted to be. I love ballet, but ballet is about the lines.
Right.
So you have these lines from your arms down to your torso, throughout your body. And so the whole point of pointe shoes, the whole point of ballet shoes being the same skin color is that it continues that line. And so when you're a black girl wearing pink shoes, the line is broken.
The line is broken.
But black bodies aren't exactly linear. We're very curvy already anyway, so we don't really fit in the genre.
Right. And to have that, I guess, sort of that constant reminder, literally everywhere you walk. Talk to me about how one processes that sort of inherent systemic racism in the arts. How does one process that as a person who teaches, as a person who dances, as a performer, as a casting person, as anything and any place that has to do with the arts? It's very Eurocentric.
Yeah.
How do you deal with it?
I think it really just depends on like where you are in who you are and in your art. I have gotten to the place where I am happy to be who I am. And that took some work. And I did really well. My parents, my mother, my grandmother did a really good job of teaching me how to assimilate.
Yeah.
Okay, so you got to assimilate. You have to do these things to fall in line. And even if you don't quite fall in line, just try. Just do the things that can compensate.
Right.
And after a while, you just get sick of compensating. I don't want to do that. I want to live and express my art through my body, the way that my body is shaped in the skin color and in the movements that are native to who I am and my people. And so I think you just have to kind of develop your conviction as an artist to say, you know what, this is who I am. This is my art.
Right.
This is my body. These are my feelings.
We are speaking with Jacqueline Cherry, the Assistant Director of Dance at the African American Cultural Center. You danced at the reopening of Tops on Jefferson. How do arts help when we're processing trauma, when we're processing grief, or even... That's certainly one subject, but also when you're processing joy and processing happiness, how do the arts play a part in that?
Expression is really important. I just went to the county fair, and I went on the turning cup ride, and I felt the thrill come through my body, and so I screamed, ah! And it was important to let that out.
Right.
To express the feeling that I had. And when we are having very deep, strong emotional feelings and we're dealing with trauma and situations that are affecting communities, it's important to express, to let go of those feelings, to acknowledge those feelings. And what art does is that there are so many different art forms. I can take my art and express something that a lot of people are feeling, and they can see it through my movement and through their, just through experiencing, watching it, they can kind of release some of that feeling that they had. Or if you hear a song and it's a song that kind of reminded you of a sad time, that might, just taking the time to reflect on that and to acknowledge that is important. So then when we have times of terror and of grief and of sadness and anger, expressing all of that together as a community and sharing in that time together is very important. It's part of the healing process to acknowledge that there's something wrong. And then to acknowledge there is hope and there can be joy after this.
Right.
And constantly reminding ourselves, our community, that we can work together to make things better and to come out of this with something that is fulfilling and joyous and happy and bringing us together. Those are the things that art does.
Mental health professionals will certainly tell you that, the body holds trauma. This isn't the first time that we've talked about that on our program, or that some people are hearing it. And so movement sort of helps release that in terms of performing in dance specifically. What role did that somatic sensory healing play in your choreography that you did for the reopening of Tops?
So important. So important. So that whole piece was about embodiment. I'm embodying this feeling of reaching up for hope. I'm kind of gesturing down in embodying sadness and grief, right? So just kind of taking those feelings and taking the things that I really wanted to highlight and using the body to illustrate them. It's very important to be able to kind of call upon kinetic empathy, right? So if you have somebody who is doing a movement that you remember doing, it might kind of, bring that to your memory.
Right.
And bring up something within you. So then when you see somebody dancing it and they're doing it in an artful way, right, that
triggers that release.
That triggers that for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it might even, if you don't notice that you're tense in your jaw or you're tense someplace in your body when you're watching somebody else dancing, that might even help you kind of release some of that just in sitting where you are.
Right. Which makes arts so important in terms of helping people heal, helping a community collectively heal.
Yeah.
And then certainly with the individual being able to release some of that energy, some of that trauma that really is held sometimes generationally in people's bodies.
Yeah.
That we don't necessarily always acknowledge because it's difficult, right? These are difficult conversations. When you talk about movement and you talk about sort of sitting with sometimes this fear, a lot of those emotions, a lot of that movement, a lot of how you carry yourself as a person of color informs the things that are around you. We were talking before we were on the air about a little bit about critical race theory, and we were discussing, traffic stops and how, in terms of de-escalating a situation, movement and body is so important. Can you talk to me about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, critical race theory, right? What do you see when you see a person of color? What does the person who is conducting the traffic stop, the police officer, what do they see when they see a person of color behind the wheel? That question is informed, or the answer to that question is going to be informed by generations of stereotypes and examples, negative examples of
all
what
that
people...
unconscious bias.
Yeah, all of these unconscious biases, all of these things, right? So as the person of color sitting in that seat, you simultaneously have to kind of take on or account for all of these things that this person might be projecting on you, and you have to fight against that. Okay, if I sit up straight and I speak proper English the correct way and make sure that I enunciate, maybe you'll see something in me that will trigger you to not feel like I'm the bad example of who you think I might be.
Right.
And so your body language might either tense up or just try to project, something other than
the fear that you might be feeling as that occurrence, as that stop happens or as that encounter happens.
Yeah, and as a person of color dealing with that situation, you could be scared, you could be angry, you could be dealing with a whole bunch of other things. And so having to wrestle with all of those things in milliseconds is really difficult, but we are expected to do those things.
And not only that, there's an expectation that our behavior will be a certain way, that, we will be as informed as law enforcement or with some sort of discipline, military training. That needs to come, I guess, inherently.
Well, we're doing it in schools.
Okay.
My daughter, so at the fair, my daughter gets ready to go into the line to get onto a ride, and she stood in line like this because she had been... We militarize our children in these inner city, in these predominantly black schools, to stand in line and be quiet and do this and da-da-da-da-da. And we instill this importance of self-control from an exterior point.
Right. But you can certainly exhibit self-control. But that panic, that inner panic that's going on, manifests itself no matter how you try. How would you teach a child, a kid, a teenager who's already, teenagers in particular have a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff.
Oh, those poor things.
In addition to that, they're in the car with their friends. Yeah. They get stopped.
Yeah.
And, people have said, if you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to worry about. Everything will be fine. But no, everything is not fine. How do you teach a child to exhibit that really adult type stuff when they're not an adult?
Right. How do you teach adults that? I don't know. And I think there's something very important to be discussed in regards, in terms of the difference between self-control and autonomy. Because, I have self-control, but if I don't have autonomy to do the things that I actually want to do, I just want to get through this traffic stop.
Right. Alive.
I don't care if you give me a ticket. Let me get out of here alive. Let me go home. Right? But if that's not under my control, and the only thing that I can control is how I respond to things, I think that might be a start in how we talk to our children, talk to our teenagers about the overall situation. It's easy for a teenager it's easy for anyone to get caught up in, the confusion of being accused of something. And all of those emotions come at once, right? So telling someone or expecting someone to really think on a macro level what's actually happening.
Right. You can't deal with what's before or even what's after. You have to really be in that in that moment.
Yeah.
And that's one of the bigger tenets of acting, of performing, is being in that moment, being present in yourself in that situation. So if you were teaching a new dancer with her brand new brown point shoes to do that, how would you explain that? How do you explain being in the moment?
I would explain first that you just have to pay attention to yourself. Pay attention to how you're feeling. Where are you holding your tension? And then just try to navigate the steps that I'm giving. Just try to navigate the steps that I'm giving. If I'm teaching you the principles of this technique, if you have any prior training, then you can pull from those things while you're paying attention. So the tap stance that I did, it was all improv. And the music cut out, which is good because the music cut out. And I just had to keep going. But I was able to pay attention to what's happening with the music, pay attention to how I can bring this kind of crazy situation back to the objective at hand, which is to honor, right? And still do the movement. So it's just kind of, it's a hard answer, but the answer is pay attention to everything and kind of
focus sort of on that one that one thing that you're doing in each moment at each time.
Yeah.
That's not difficult.
It's not difficult at all. Yeah, just.
I think that a lot of times we aren't present in moments in our daily lives. It's a skill, and it's a skill that I think a lot of us have to constantly work on when we're having conversations with people, to listen.
Yeah.
And not be formulating the next thing that we're going to say, which means I'm not listening to what the other person is saying. And so it's a way to communicate with your body. It's a way to communicate certainly with language. All of these things play a huge role in sort of how we present ourselves, how we carry ourselves as people of color through the world.
Yeah.
Do you find that it's more or less challenging to be a person of color than it was now than it was 10 years ago?
Oh, I don't think it's more or less challenging. I do think, however, for my personal opinion, comes from a recent kind of enlightenment, right? Personal enlightenment. So I wouldn't say that it was more difficult or easy, because there are ways that we can, again, assimilate and kind of compensate for things in ways that we hadn't in the past, but there are still problems that overshadow, there are still problems that overshadow our existence at times. Sometimes I hate to be a nihilist, and I hate to be a black pessimist, but, the stereotypes and all of the negativity and all of the things that can really affect your comfort as an Africanized person walking around here, that's what needs to be tackled, if that answers the question.
It does. I think it's not an easy question to be answered. And I think probably the biggest takeaway from today for the listeners is really about your body, really about how you move through the world, and paying attention to that, and understanding the relationship between how other people see you and how you carry yourself. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's fascinating conversation, and I can't wait to see what is next for you.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Jacqueline Cherry is the Assistant Director of Dance at the African American Cultural Center. This is Buffalo What's Next on WBFO and WBFO HD1 Buffalo, WOLN Olean, and WUBJ Jamestown, your NPR station. I'm Bridget Jaipal Valenza. Thanks for listening.